Hi, my name is Rich Koslerich, and I'll be moderating this discussion of the impact of clean energy on low-income populations and the related issues of environmental justice. I'm a distinguished visiting professor here at the Schar School, as well as co-director of the Center for Energy Science and Policy. And our center is a joint uh, venture between the School of Business and the Schar School, with strong input from the College of Science and the College of Engineering. And we look at the intersection and integration of science and policy in the energy area. And our focus is on thoughtful analysis that leads to the involvement of both national, state, and local governments in the energy policy space. I want to thank Sarah Wright, who's our one of the center's student fellows, and Paul Nooney and Julie Hudson and April Grayson and Bill Trost, who are from the Schar School, for their support in producing this event, which I hope will be the first of a series that we will be doing to address the challenges of energy security and climate in the 21st century. Before I get to the introduction of our discussants here this morning, just a housekeeping tip. This event is presented on YouTube, and for those who are watching, if you'll please use the live chat function to the right of your screen as you see it to ask any questions. We'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can before the end of the discussion. Let me just introduce our two participants very briefly. Scott Sklar is president of the Stella Group and adjunct professor at George Washington University. Stella is a firm that facilitates clean energy, distributed energy utilization and technology from both the community solar level in the US, but also in developing countries as well. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University, teaches several courses on sustainable energy, and serves as the energy director of George Washington's Environment and Energy Management Institute. Scott has served in a number of capacities in the area of solar and renewable energy, both in Washington and elsewhere. He's currently on the board of directors of the Solar Foundation and the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. Scott is one of those guys who practices what he preaches, and his home is a demonstration project in a lot of the technologies that we'll talk about today. He lives in a self-powered solar home in Arlington, Virginia, not too far from the Schar School where we would normally gather. So, Scott, thanks very much for being with us. Our other participant is Mark Wolf. Mark is executive director of the National Energy Assistance Directors Association. He's a leading expert on grant and finance initiatives for low and moderate income households. He served as a volunteer on the Biden-Harris Policy Committee. He has extensive experience with state energy, human services, housing agencies, all addressing energy and housing affordability concerns, which are very much at the core of what we want to talk about this morning. He represents states' low-income and energy directors' interests before Congress, helps develop appropriation levels for low-income energy assistance program, which addresses the impact of pandemic-related job losses, another important aspect here. And he has extensive experience both with the public policy sector, non-government public policy sector, but the government as well. Let me just kick this off with a couple of remarks. And last May of 2020, Fatih Birol, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, said that the COVID-produced disruptions in the energy system made 2019 seem like 100 years ago. Well, here we are today, almost a year after that, and it seems like 2020 was 50 years ago. Just in terms of the rapidity of the changes when we look back, we can see that we've got the Biden announcement on climate change, the COVID-19 relief package, now talk about one or more additional economic plans for jobs and infrastructure. We have COP26 coming up in November, where there's going to be a real push to endorse a no carbon energy future by 2030, 2060. You fill in the date. But all of these things are kind of colliding in the public policy space. And for me, it reveals the lack of a systematic approach to the impact of what promises to be a cleaner energy future on communities and disadvantaged populations who are least able to afford the benefits of clean energy. So, how do policymakers deliver on these promises and still address the social and environmental justice issues? So, starting with Mark and then Scott, maybe you can kind of set the stage for our discussion today. Observations that you might have on this fundamental question of just access to clean energy. What's changed? What remains the same? Mark?
Well, thanks, Richard, for the opportunity today to be part of your first seminar. I've known Scott, I think, since many, many years now.
My beard was dark, as you do.
Yes, I've known. We've known each other since our facial hair has gone from dark to gray. Maybe we could put the PowerPoint up, and I can speak from that. Is it up?
Here we go. Look at that. Unbelievable.
Thank you. Maybe we can skip to the first slide. One of the key points when thinking about energy poverty, social justice, energy affordability, they're all terms that are to some extent interchangeable. It's the size of the population. How many people are we talking about that we're worried about? And a lot of it's definitional, but by most definitions that the federal government uses and state government, it's roughly 1 out of 3 households in the United States struggle to pay their energy bills. There's plenty of background data on that. For those of you who follow census data, for example, they do a monthly survey now, again, with families all saying they struggle to pay basic expenses. And so I think when we talk about energy affordability, it gives you another lens. We're talking about a third of the US population. And some of the definitions that have been broached, during the pandemic, take us up as high as 50% of the residential population. These are households that really have no savings and are very vulnerable to any disruption in income. We don't have a well-funded national affordability program. At the end of the day, our programs are grant-based. And for those of you who kind of follow the jargon, an entitlement program is like Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, where as long as you meet the eligibility requirements, you're guaranteed the services. In other words, the Treasury Department keeps printing money. For grant and aid program, it's subject to an annual appropriation. And when the money runs out, the program's over. Energy assistance programs all come under the latter, and all the programs, the funding runs out. And I'll talk about that a little bit on the next page. Next slide. So for some more background, how significant are energy bills? Averages are just what they are. It's like old economics saying, what's the temperature is about, 50 degrees, except, you have 1 foot in a freezing bucket and 1 foot in a hot bucket. So you can say it's about average. Most Americans, energy is affordable. It's at most about 2 or 3% of the annual budget. For low-income families, it averages about 8%. And for those with very old homes or lowest of the incomes, you can see expenditures of 13 to 15%. What that means is that energy is a burden on those families. And what we're learning more and more as we look more deeper into the data is that the social justice implications are very significant. 34% of Black households are low income, 32% of Hispanic households fall under 150% of the federal poverty level. That's kind of the lower income tier of income. The other thing that's recently been found, again, there's nothing rocket science about these insights, but it all involves research and better understanding. There's been recent research that suggests that people of color have the highest energy bills. They live in older neighborhoods and older homes, so it follows they have older appliances, older heating and cooling systems, so their bills are higher. And people really hadn't thought about that before because we do these averages. So we'll say on average it's about 8%, but then you dig deeper, you see it's much more complicated. Let's go to the next slide. And again, the facts all bear this out. A home built before 1960 uses 1.2 times more energy than a home built after 2000. And who lives in the older homes? Again, you don't want to overly generalize, but lower income families predominantly live in older housing, and not the high-end older housing you see, say, in Old Town. These are older homes, often in very bad shape. One difference that people, again, thinking about the country, low-income home ownership is much higher in the South than, say, in the North and Midwest because housing prices are very cheap. Many of the homes are in very poor shape, but there is a high rate of home ownership. When you look at the data, and I don't want to go into too much data, for example, 22 million households in the US have poor or no insulation. Low-income households account for 73% of those households. So where the families are who are not just vulnerable to the price of energy, but also bear the burden of living in the least efficient homes, it's low and moderate income families. Let's move to the next slide. So what does the federal government offer? We have programs that were established around 40 years ago. They clearly help families, but they're not funded sufficiently to help more than a fraction of the eligible households. So we estimate about 1 out of 6 households that are eligible for energy assistance receive help. But for weatherization, which basically is to retrofit a home, it's only about 1 out of 100. So most of the resources go towards bill payment. And, to some extent, that reflects the lobbying power of utilities. Utilities care most about getting their bills paid. And again, it's dealing with the immediate problems. Weatherization is a longer-term need, which hopefully, if you've read about Biden's proposal, that's still being developed, there's an initiative to retrofit about at least 1 million homes a year, which still won't make a big difference in terms of the overall, but significant ramp up from where we are. The other kinds of programs that we have include discount programs, something we call percent of income payment program, which sounds like, again, all these arcane terms, but the idea is that no family should spend more than a certain percentage of their income for energy. These are the most expensive programs, and you only see those in the most progressive states, the states that seem most engaged in these kinds of issues. And not surprising, it tends to be states in the Northeast, California, Oregon, the states that have generally more progressive policies for these kinds of concerns. Next slide. The pandemic has had a major, major impact on people's abilities to pay their bills, and we've spent a lot of our time the last year on that. Most state moratoriums are expiring. Those are moratoriums that prevent shutoffs. When the pandemic hit, a number of states put in blanket moratoriums, not just on energy, but also on water. Those are also expiring. We're going from about 82% of the public covered by a moratorium right now. For April 30th, only 49% will be covered, and that will drop rapidly through the end of the summer. 11 states have no active moratoriums whatsoever, meaning the utilities can disconnect customers in arrears no matter what their situation. And then 14 states have moratoriums that are going to expire in the next 10 days. So the situation is quite serious for affordability. And I think one thing to put this in perspective is that we have obviously systems in place before the pandemic hit. Those systems to protect families from shutoff, from being behind on their bills. Those systems have been severely stretched by the pandemic. People in some states have not had to pay an energy bill for over a year. So their energy bill could be up to $2,000, and those families don't have the resources to pay it. So how do we address that? A couple of things we did. We tried to create energy as an economic indicator, and we've had some success on that in terms of people's ability to afford their bills. I think that if you look at trend lines during difficult economic periods, people fall behind on their bills. And I think that's a clear indication of the overall economy. For example, in the last year, the total amount of electric arrearages have increased from $8 billion to $15.8 billion, and natural gas from $2.5 to $5 billion. A clear indication that people are unable to pay their bills, are falling behind. And the fact that a third of the population is struggling is very significant. Move to the next slide. One after that. So that again just gives you a very quick overview of increases in arrearages by selected states. What I think it shows again is just how much it's out of the norm. And so you could see that during normal years, this is a challenge to help people with affordability. During the pandemic, it's moved to crisis. Move to the next slide. So the way I'd like to end this my presentation is say, energy affordability, social justice, it's not just about energy. Energy affordability intersects with a series of other concerns. It intersects with climate change. We cannot get emissions down in the housing sector unless we address the low and moderate income housing part. And part of my point is saying that it's a third to maybe 40% of the total is to point out just how significant that sector is. The other piece of connection is with public health. And I think in that case, if your house has energy problems related to it, there's mold from a leaky water system, there's asthma triggers, those things can cause public health issues. We have to strengthen affordable housing. When we talk about that, we're talking about a third of the US housing stock. Creates jobs. It's related to rebuilding the grid. And lastly, when people think of low-income families, they don't think of them as homeowners. But about 40% of lower-income families are homeowners. So by focusing on how do we help retrofit their home, if the house is worth maybe $100,000, $150,000, the energy part envelope of that house is quite significant. So by helping the family replace its heating and cooling system with a modern, up-to-date, efficient system, lighting, insulation, you're helping that family stabilize their home and ultimately build asset value. So when we think about energy affordability, if we put in the context of these other lenses, you can see how essential it is to both address a person's ability to pay their bill, but also to make their home as energy efficient as possible. And the last slide is just a list of links to other resources. Thank you. Look forward to questions.
Mark, that was really terrific. So before turning it over to just to plant an idea there, as we discuss later on, sort of what does the experience this winter in Texas kind of illustrate in terms of the kinds of issues that you've identified? But I'll let Scott go
okay,
first.
If we could do my slide show up there and flip immediately to the fourth slide. So let's see how this works technically. Modern technology. Oh, look at that. Very good. So these are the facts I want you to know. And by the way, I do a lot of projects in low-income energy all over the world, frankly. And I think I want to start off by saying that low-income populations pay not only the highest energy rates, but as Mark said so correctly, energy is one of the highest parts of their budgets after their rents or their mortgage. So it's a huge issue. Low-income populations experience the worst electric power quality. What am I talking about? Those are the surge, sags, and transients that come out of your wall socket that ruin equipment. Refrigerators, stoves, and of course, all the digital stuff, TVs, and and everything else, the gadgets we have, they blow them out. And if you look at the appliance costs, even of new appliances, low-income people replace them more because of bad power quality. Most fossil and nuclear power generation is in lower income areas. Now we understand why. It's low, you generally lower cost land rates and other issues I'll get to, but the pollution out of the smokestack or the hot water out of the plants have huge environmental impacts to the health and quality of life in low-income areas that the rest of the American public is sheltered from. And energy waste, the coal, slag, and ash, the nuclear waste, the fracking water ponds and waste are all in low-income areas. It's not in Arlington County where I live in a suburb of Washington, D.C. No way that would be allowed, but obviously it is. And most electric power outages occur in lower income areas. Why? Because they're older distribution grids. They just get knocked down more. They have more problems with squirrels and cars hitting poles and transformers blowing. And as you saw in Puerto Rico, and to a slight lesser extent in the California grid failures because of the wildfires, and recently Texas because of the freeze, that in Puerto Rico, most of the people who died did not die from the hurricane, about 600 people. Over 3,000 people died because they either couldn't get to a hospital, but even more because today, when you're ill, you get even Medicare pays for it. You get a machine. You get a dialysis machine at home. You get a heart machine. You get a ventilator machine. You have machines that help keep you alive, and they have batteries for a half hour. But if you can't get it for days, you're dead. And so we have major impact on what I call the safety net within the safety net of how we deal with these issues. And lastly, I think the most important point I made here is energy regulations, whether it's electric rates, power plant sightings, waste sightings, whatever. The regulatory process really doesn't have an easy input for the lower income population. Yeah, some of the states have community advocates that do it, and they're 1 out of 80 people that input. But frankly, a lot of the people whose these decisions really impact the most have the least part in the regulatory process. So let's flip to the next slide, please. And so I just want to say that there's been a lot of great studies on hazardous waste sites in low-income areas. This is one at the University of Michigan. Next one, please. There has been a lot of wonderful studies on renewable energy development law and policy and environmental justice. I put one here for you as well. Next one, please. Let's skip that one and go to the next EPA mapping tool. EPA has put out a great mapping tool released February 2021 on that could reshape environmental justice. And so we want to make sure we're beginning to see ways in which, as we're implementing policy, we understand some of the issues I brought to light in the first slide. Next one, please. There are lots of tools and actions that go beyond federal grants or state programs, though obviously Mark is the national expert on that. There are state public benefit funds that come out of, there are actually little fees on your utility bills that can go towards energy efficiency in buildings and renewable energy. There's on-bill financing that about 19 states allow that I'm going to talk about. There's community renewables where the private sector actually puts up systems, large systems, sometimes community solar or community wind, particularly, some cases community biogas, and lower income people can subscribe to it at a lower rate than they pay their electric company and get local clean energy. So we're going to take a look at some of that. Next slide, please. Many of the states have regulatory standards for energy efficiency and renewables. These are the energy efficiency resource standards. Next slides, please. Some states, I'm using Washington Clean Energy Fund. They've developed actual funds to drive clean energy in low-income communities, and it gives you, in this case, about 8 examples of what they're doing. I just picked this randomly because I thought it was demonstrative. Next slide, please. These are the states that have public benefit funds. Again, this little rate that goes to lower income populations. Next slide, please. Let's skip that one. Let's skip that one. Let's skip. This is a interesting article. No, back, that's one. In this case, California, because of the wildfires, is starting to give solar and battery systems. So people experiencing outages for longer periods of time or will be subject to them can keep their critical functions going, their refrigerator, their Wi-Fi, their TV set, a light, so that they can survive through the hard times. And then in the good times, it just reduces their electricity. I have, again, as Richard mentioned, a self-powered home. I have a self-powered office building with a different set of technologies. I do this all the time. And this is now batteries are at grid parity these days. And of course, solar is very low cost. Next slide, please. I did a recent paper with Tom Stanton, the National Regulatory Research Institute, on what's called on-bill financing. And here, about a third of the United States, the regulators and in some cases the utilities are saying, hey, for people that don't own their homes or they live in apartments, and frankly, half the businesses lease it, they don't own the building. And so it doesn't make sense to put something on a building you don't own, even if the owner wants it. In this case, you can finance that through your meter, not through you or your credit, meaning that if you want to put in energy efficiency or smarter windows or a solar water heater or a solar electric battery system, you can finance it off your utility bill. And what's interesting is you finance it so that your savings is more than what you would pay on this added fee to your bill. So you're cash positive the day you do it. It's not tied to your credit score. And if you give up your lease next year, the person who's at that meter, who's in that apartment or in that commercial space, has that obligation because they still have the asset. And it's a great way for utilities because then they know what's going in and they can plan what's good for distribution. And it's also obviously good for people who have low resources or businesses that don't have resources because they can just finance it with the utility. And I'm pushing that the utility should not just get an administrative fee, but a fee so that actually when they're deciding, hey, do I want to make 9% on building a power plant, or I want to make 9% in on-bill financing that reduces the electricity need on my grid, they would say, hey, I'm making the same with a lot less pain. I don't have to worry about zoning and regulatory issues. I can just let people make choices. I find this as a major important trend. Next, please. These are the state actions on bill financing. And I think you're going to see it across the entire United States. I'm very excited about it. Next, please. This is a publication I did with a bunch of professors at George Washington. And it was actually a grant from the Southern Company on saying, how do we drive these community renewable projects, these community solar projects, to the low-income part of our ratepayer base? And, I would love to say it's not complicated. It is. You generally need a donation of land from either the city or the county or a university or a closed industrial park or a brownfield. It needs to be near a power line. And, of course, you have to work with community organizations to get folks to be willing to sign an agreement for the power. And usually an anchor, whether it's a university or a store like IKEA or something that, or a government, a local government that buys some of the electricity as well. So we can go to private financiers and develop a targeted captive clean energy park for our lower income people. Renewable energy should not just be for the middle class and the rich. So this was a tactic to use private sector money to allow access. Next, please. This is an example of a program, February 2021, also Washington State. Sorry, I guess I picked them twice. And this was an award for a low-income solar deployment program. And so to deal with it. But we have projects like this in every state of the union. Next, please. And that's a chart you can't read. Next, please. Codes and standards. When housing is being built, the building codes are critical. There are some states and cities stepping out. Chicago, Washington are the cities. Illinois, New York are also stepping out. Stretch codes, really driving energy efficiency and water efficiency in buildings. And the last slide, please. Just putting it all in perspective, we all share this little boat. We're all on the boat together. There's none of this, some on the boat do well and some of the boats do bad, because in the end, that makes us all do bad. So I think a goal of a lot of us who are either in the low income world, so ably like Mark Wolf, or in the technology deployment world like Scott Sklar here, our goal is to not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the extraction, use, and of energy are the highest use of fresh water, which we don't have on our planet, very little, and losing. Obviously, Clean Air Act regulated emissions for those of you who have asthma or have gotten cancers, and of course, energy stability and rates, so there are no surprises tied to globalization, politics, burst pipelines, and all this other stuff that we live through. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Scott, Mark, that was a great introduction. I may just introduce a question here that came up because it goes to something Scott asked. This is from Star Tides, which is one of the really interesting pieces of George Mason University's involvement in all of these issues. But your nuclear point, Scott, the oft-promised small modular reactor as kind of the wave of the future in nuclear power. Do they pose the same kinds of concerns that you had when you mentioned the?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be fast, but distributed generation of all types is going to help the grid be more stable. So that's the good news. You're going to have blends of technologies, and there are going to be certain reasons to have certain blends versus the others. So yeah, we are in a third wave. If you looked at what happened in telecom with cellular and satellites, fiber optics, we have self-healing grids. So if a cell tower goes down, the cell network doesn't go down. They triangulate around each other, and you have functionality. And same with the internet. We have data centers that go down every day. The internet doesn't stop. It triangulates around and keeps going. What's happening in energy is we're getting smarter and smaller and more distributed so that we have greater resiliency in our grid. And I'm doing a lot of microgrids now, not just in military bases, but in lower income areas or areas that are facing climate change issues like flooding and ocean surges and hurricanes, where we can keep the grids working for all people. And so where nuclear plays, a smaller nuclear plays than that might work. But we have a lot of options right now, and we need to use them. And the microgrids that I'm doing are, again, all blends primarily of renewables and energy storage, but have some natural gas generations or combined heat and power, sometimes use legacy old diesels, and we keep it going, and it keeps it going seamlessly.
Mark, I don't know if you want to jump in on the nuclear issue, but but this does raise the question that clean energy is costly. And, you know,
I want to just say it is not. Wind is the cheapest form of power on the planet right this second. Solar, now we can do solar batteries less than natural gas plants, and have done about 30 of them in the United States. It is not costly. In fact, just the opposite.
I was in a panel discussion with a group of people, including Andrew Light, who used to be here at Mason, but now is at DOE as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. But they were talking about, you know, from the perspective of India, and the representative of the Indian government who was there said the lowest cost energy for us during the day is solar. When the sun goes down, the lowest cost source of energy is coal. And it's really a complicated issue. Mark, do you want to jump in?
Thanks. Yeah, the concern that's been raised is that, you know, and then the residential side, as middle and upper middle income families are more likely to like convert to solar, who's left supporting the grid? How do we pay for the grid? And lower income families are less likely to switch to solar for the upfront costs, the shorter time horizon. And so that has become a question of, will lower income families end up getting higher bills as a result? Hasn't really been thought through that much. And it's really just starting because the percent of people that use solar still isn't that high. But there is an equity issue of how do you protect lower income families as families who remain with the grid end up having a higher share of maintenance. So how do you shift some of those costs to people who are using solar because they still need the grid? Most people can't move totally off of it.
Again, I would just like to say to my friend Mark here, and that's why on-bill financing and community solar makes it affordable and it's also for energy efficiency. I want to remind everybody on this webinar, it is always less expensive to save energy than generated from any source, whether it's nuclear, fossil, renewables, any source. Energy efficiency is the play. So having on-bill financing, which allows people to make energy efficiency choices and renewable choices that are less than what they're paying from the grid, I think is dramatic. And again, if we, as some of these programs do, let the utilities make a same profit as they do building a power plant, that maintains your utility system and doesn't create this shift in support.
Mm-hmm. Where it gets complicated, and I think this gets to Scott's point, there's for on-bill finance and financing programs. If you get your spreadsheet out, you know, over 5 or 10 years, the numbers work in most places. You know, replace your old natural gas heating and cooling system with a solar system. The numbers work, except most lower income homeowners don't have a 10-year horizon. You know, they're thinking about tomorrow. They're thinking about next week. And there's a lot of suspicion and unease about things like on-bill finance. And so we've sort of been thinking increasingly that government has to step in with grant funding, that, you know, there is a role for finance, but that for the lowest income homeowners, this has to be grant funded. Even if the spreadsheet works, even the numbers low,
I don't disagree with that. I agree with you.
But for middle and upper middle income families, we're thinking, you know, financing works. And so again, bringing the lens, you know, what's the lower income population, you're thinking of it as a market. It's a large market, but their ability to take on debt is very limited. And their horizon's different. You know, they don't think about it the same way we do, where the multifamily part of low income is different. It has more sophisticated managers, you know, 10-year financing program. They're comfortable with it. They understand it. So I think when we're thinking about the impact and transitions, we need to kind of split the market into different segments and see which piece works well and which piece doesn't.
I mean, it comes back to this basic question of how do you pay for all this? You know, you look at the Biden executive order on climate. It goes through all of these aspects, international and domestic, including social justice, and then, you know, ends at the, you know, almost if not the next to the last paragraph of the executive order, which says basically all of this is subject to appropriated funds. Now, how, how, and Mark, you've been involved, maybe still are in sort of thinking of the administration, but how do you kind of get Congress, the American public, and the administration kind of correlated on these? Because you're absolutely right. This is not just an energy issue; it's a housing issue. Who pays for the infrastructure? Will the bill or bills that's going to be coming out address some of these things? That's what makes this all also interesting, a little scary, I think.
Well, what I like about public benefit funds in the States is these are charges on everybody's utility bill, like a quarter a month, 25 cents, and goes into a pot that goes towards the low income part of the community for exactly the things we're talking about. So having things that where money is already sort of sequestered for that purpose rather than relying on appropriation cycles should be our goal. That said, this administration is going to has committed, and frankly, what Congress passed at the end of the last administration as well to address COVID has huge amounts of money, and we'd be crazy if we don't want to divert it into these areas we're talking about, so that Mark doesn't have to fight every damn year as he does for money into the LIHEAP program and weatherization and everything else that's important. And it would be nice to create some kind of legacy funds that are paid as you go. So that's my own personal view. And Mark, you can say I'm totally psychotic thinking that, but I'm throwing it out there.
No, I think you're right. I mean, the thing is that if we bring the lens of saying, okay, let's just think of it as a climate change problem. Let's not think of it as a low income problem. Let's think of it as this is
right.
Climate change. We've got to get emissions down. We've got to move to a clean energy system. We've got to change the grid. We've got to move people to solar. We think about it that way, and then we say, okay, a third of the population, or about 25% of the population is upper middle class, relatively well off, high percent of homeowners. The broad middle, it's a mix, still a pretty high share of homeowners. They're comfortable with debt, they understand it. The bottom third is different, but they generate, that third of the population generates a lot of emissions, older housing stock. How do we retrofit that sector? And how do we think about doing it efficiently and quickly? It's very complicated and expensive. And that's, I think, what the barriers start running into. So when Scott was talking about public benefit funds, Massachusetts, for example, has a very strong fund. I think they do about 80,000 housing units a year out of that program.
Absolutely.
Discount programs, that's like a model. Some states are moving forward aggressively. California has a very large low-income retrofit program. Those states are more money will help them move faster. New York, they're ready. They've got trained staff. They've been training people for many years. Texas, not so much. Florida, not so much. There are no state funds available. It's a much more difficult problem. But if the goal is to say, look, we've got to get our emissions down, we've got to move to a clean energy economy, then we have to look at the country as a patchwork of programs. It's very messy. It's not clean. It's not, no pun there, but it's a very messy system. There are good models out there to work from, but we haven't come to a national policy yet with very clear goals. And I think that's the next step. And how do we do that in a way that addresses the lower income part of this pie? Because without addressing that part, and the bottom of the middle class as well, we're just not going to get there. And we're going to be frustrated. And so I think that's where all this leads to. So it's not just an issue of energy justice and poverty. It's also an issue of how do we get to where we want to go on climate change.
Yeah. Let me pull in a couple of questions because I want to save a couple of minutes at the end to talk about the role of universities in all of this too. One of the questions comes from Joel Hicks, who's a colleague in our our Center for Energy Science and Policy here, but local governments seem to be facing some barriers to how they can deal with energy efficiency regulations. Are there workarounds out there? And
Well, yeah,
go ahead.
I'm just saying there are a couple of programs, some that are at Department of Energy and HUD, to teach the municipal and county code officials. That's really important because a lot of them stand in the way of, coatings on windows, thermal barrier paints on roofs, great ways to reduce heat in the summer and allow more heat from the sun in the winter in building structure, just as an example. And how do we deal with those technologies that are new on the market, absolutely proven by the national laboratories, but slow on the uptake because officials aren't? So that's one thing that's very important. The other one is really education, and we're going to talk, of course, on the university. But I've had these two self-powered buildings for 20 years. Every week, I have now, of course, socially distant tours of engineers and architects and local government officials. Because how do we expect people to adopt things they've never ever seen? And how do they learn the practical issues? Because there are problems with new technologies, and even though they may be the smarter choice, it takes time to educate people on new technology. And so we need a lot more what I call applied learning. And I'm doing some workforce training in Appalachia with the state of Maryland and the University of Frostburg State University. But at the community colleges, the technical schools, really spending time working so that the practitioners, the people that put in heating and cooling systems and windows and deal with the housing envelope, the roofs and the walls, understand their options. So, and that's where some of these funds that are coming out of the government, out of the CARES Act and ARPA acts can really be put in. So we start retraining how we renovate buildings and how we are what's allowable in financing.
Josh Grisset, one of our first student fellows in the Energy Center, asks about if you have 90% of existing buildings still standing in 20 years, how do you incentivize retrofit fits within that universe?
Well, for for both commercial and residential ownership, and Mark talked about a significant percentage of low-income people own their homes. They're starting to do what we call CPACE and RPACE, and community assessed clean energy evaluation, which means fundamentally, I cannot, if I want to put insulation in my home, I can basically not pay all of my property taxes. And basically, I can show the local government, instead of paying my $4,000 a year, I'm not going to pay taxes for 2 years. I'm going to insulate my home, my building, or my small business. And when I sell the house at the end, when I pass away, or whoever refinances it, if they inherit it, that money has to be paid off back to the local government. So they're deferring local taxes for high value benefit. And that's predominantly energy efficiency and some solar and some cases other renewables, geothermal heat pumps, for instance. And so that's good. And that's another tactic to allow folks to make the right choice without harming them economically. This whole issue of paying as you go and making these choices cash positive are very essential. So I totally understand what Mark's been saying, and I 100% agree. And our whole tactic in these programs are trying to make it that way. So at the moment you do it, you're actually spending less a month, whatever choice you make.
I see we've got just about 5 minutes left, but I want to turn it over to Mark, and maybe in your comments, we'll get back to Scott too, just some thoughts about the role of universities. Scott's been doing a lot of excellent work at GW and elsewhere, but how do we get both as teaching and research institutions, universities involved in these issues of equal access to clean energy?
I think there's a very clear role for universities, and there aren't that many university centers that think about these questions. I've been kind of looking at this as well and thinking, what is the role of universities? A couple of things that I've thought about the last few months, especially as the social justice issues have percolated to the top and the concern about climate change now is more forefront. There's a lot we don't know that lends itself to a university setting. We don't know very much about, for example, water use in the country. By municipality, we know the structures, but we don't know very much about how much water can be saved. There are a lot of questions that I think needs kind of a university take. I think this other issue of broadening the climate change lens to think from a market-based approach, how do we transition the residential energy stock? I mean, the question that Josh asked is a very good one. It should be mandatory, it should be voluntary. There are questions of personal decision-making. These are not simple questions. We've tried a lot of things in the past that have not gone to scale. I think a university kind of lens could help policymakers think more proactively. Is it just putting money on the table? Is it incentives? It is requirements? How do we get people to make and owners to make these decisions? And the last thing I think I'll put out is that this is not easy. If you're an upper middle class homeowner and your energy bill is 2% of your income, and you retrofit your home and you can reduce that 2% to 1.9%, do you care? Why? You're not going to do it for that reason. You're not going to do it to save money. Well, it's going to motivate families. Building owners have so many things to deal with to maintain those buildings. Why do this energy work? And we could talk about that for hours. I mean, Scott and I could have a whole seminar on that. How do we go from a small group of people saying, okay, here's where we want to go, it sounds pretty straightforward, to then the much larger community, which is not getting the kind of traction we need? And so I think a university can kind of bring people together to think about policies that will move the ball forward in kind of a safe space, so to speak, in a congressional hearing that's not so safe, different kind of. So anyhow, I'll leave it at that. That I think there's a very significant opportunity for universities to engage in this area.
Scott, do you have other thoughts?
First of all, George Mason University and Richard personally, I want to thank you for hosting this, because the first thing universities can do is be centers of dialogue and awareness. And I frankly don't know, and I'm in this field, almost any university not really focusing on these issues. So thank you, first of all, for doing that. I would like to stress that what I really think needs to be done, and we have done it in other ways, and I hate to use this term, I really do, is this sort of whole public-private philanthropic partnerships. And the other issue is we really need to include community-based organizations who deal with low-income issues all the time, and our delivery entities, as well as national organizations like Mark Wolf's as well, because they deal with these issues day to day. And then we really need to figure out how we link the analytical side, and not just on energy, in fact, on deployment, on money, economics and accounting. All of this stuff matters. And how, I teach these interdisciplinary courses because I believe you can't understand energy or environment unless you understand water and engineering and economics and sustainability and environmental science and all the other things. So how do we create these cross pollination of what's within university or within groups of universities and local groups to focus on answers to these problems practically, not a peer-reviewed paper, but practically? And I think there's a lot of opportunity here and a lot of creativity. And by exposing each other to what we know, we'll get better answers than any of us pontificating, on our, front lawn. So I guess to say, I would like to see universities step out and frankly sit down with the philanthropic community, maybe some of the federal and state agencies as well, the government community, and pull together some funds, but pollinate the approach so that we have practical local actors as well as technical actors and financial actors, some in the private sector as well who are into this, and see what potions, what ingredients we can put together that speed this up a little and become more meaningful in people's lives. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I'm happy that Lynn Wells' Star Tide from the Fairfax campus of Mason is on, because he's been doing some really interesting work in precisely those areas, and including paying attention to Puerto Rico, which I think too often we sitting where we are overlook. I want to thank both of you for this. This has been a great. The hour has gone fast, and I didn't get to all my questions.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking too. One of the things that we should be doing again as a university is trying to find a way to bring together people from the communities who are directly affected by this,
Absolutely.
and listen to them. And I will confess that we do not do enough of that here. But your presentations are a reminder of the need to do more in this area. So many thanks. I appreciate again the widening of the aperture here to look at not just energy but housing and the related issues that we spoke about. So for everyone who joined us online, thank you very much, and we will see what we can do about maybe another session later on to get into more detail on
Would
this
love
issue.
that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the invitation.
Not at all.